Hello, and welcome back to Political Science 1513.W1, American Federal Government Online. As usual, I am your instructor, Conner Alford, and in this video we're going to begin our discussion of political ideologies. Towards that end, our learning objectives for this week are as follows. Number 1, explain the concept of a political ideology and describe the core tenets of the following examples of ideology: anarchism, communism, socialism, and fascism. Number 2, explain the traditional spectrum of ideologies and the main reasons why this spectrum is no longer considered to be an accurate map of political beliefs. Learning objective number 3, explain how the four-cornered ideological grid improves upon the traditional spectrum. Learning objective number 4, identify the three major ideologies active in American politics today, their central principles and core disagreements. The three major ideologies you'll need to be able to talk about are conservatism, liberalism, and libertarianism. Learning objective number 5 asks for you to apply the core principles of each of these ideologies in order to discern specific issue positions. And then finally, we're going to close with learning objective number 6, where you are asked to distinguish between social and economic issues, and that one's going to be especially important for the purposes of our assessment this week. All right, having covered our learning objectives, let's start at the very beginning, and that means we've got to define our key concept. So what is a political ideology? Well, your textbook describes the term political ideology as follows: a comprehensive set of beliefs about the nature of politics and the proper role of government. So the best way to understand an ideology is as a core set of beliefs and values about the appropriate role of government and the overarching nature of politics in our world. There are a couple of key points about ideologies that I want you to keep in the back of your mind. So first, do not confuse an ideology with a political party. A political party is an actual organization or club with which one can acquire membership by registering. So, for example, the Republican Party and the Democratic Party are both political parties operating in the United States. One becomes a Republican by registering as a Republican, and one becomes a Democrat by registering as a Democrat. But you don't register to be a conservative, a liberal, or a libertarian, an anarchist, a fascist, a communist, or a socialist. To be a socialist, you just have to believe in socialism. To be a conservative, you just have to hold a certain set of core beliefs and values. So ideologies are belief systems. They are not organizations. Political parties, on the other hand, are organizations. It is worth noting that political parties quite frequently have an officially accepted ideology or an ideology that is very, very popular among the members of that particular party. So, for example, in the United States, the Democratic Party tends to adhere to the liberal ideology, while the Republican Party tends to be a little bit more conservative. This is not always true. There are some liberal Republicans and some conservative Democrats. There are also members of both parties that don't comply with either of these two ideologies. On the Republican side, for example, you have people like Senator Rand Paul, who, while registered as Republican, is ideologically more akin to a libertarian. On the flip side, in the Democratic Party, we have people like Ocasio-Cortez and Bernie Sanders. Both of them are registered Democrats, but they are socialists, not American liberals. So, what we're going to find is that there is a relationship between political parties and ideologies, but that they are not synonymous. It is also important for you to understand that ideologies are comprehensive or general. If you learn somebody's ideology, that provides you with a great deal of information about where they most likely stand on a whole host of issues. You can contrast an ideology, which is general, with an issue position, which is particular. An issue position is a position that a person or a group takes on a particular political problem. So, for example, if you were to tell me that you are anti-gun, that would give me a great deal of information about where you stand on that particular issue. If somebody tells you that they are pro-gun, that indicates that they don't support more stringent gun control. Conversely, if they tell you that they are anti-gun, that indicates that they do support a great deal of gun control. So if we understand that this statement gives you a great deal of information about where somebody stands on a particular issue, the next question is, what does it tell us about where they stand on other issues? And the answer is not really much anything at all. If somebody tells you they're pro-gun, you know where they stand on the Second Amendment. You don't know where they stand on abortion or gay marriage or foreign policy. They haven't given you any information that you can use to guess where they stand on raising the minimum wage. But if somebody tells you their ideology, then you have a pretty good indication of where they stand on all of those issues and more. Ideologies give you general information, and they provide the core beliefs and values from which people, at least in theory, derive their particular issue positions. Understand, however, that while we all seem to have certain ideologies, we're not always going to adopt positions that are consistent with those because we're not good at thinking ideologically. In other words, we all have core beliefs and values, but we don't always adopt particular issue positions on specific political controversies that are consistent with those. And that might be a problem or it might not. I don't know. I'll let you decide. But again, understand ideologies are not the same thing as issue positions. Pro-life and pro-choice. These tell you where somebody stands on one issue, the issue of abortion. And so they are positions and not ideologies. Whereas conservative and liberal, these are ideologies. So now that we know what ideologies are, we know how to distinguish ideologies from political parties or from issue positions. The next thing that we need to talk about is how to compare and contrast these ideologies. And generally speaking, the academic community has come up with a couple of different approaches that we can use to help figure out how these ideologies are similar to or distinct from one another and to what extent these distinctions occur. The most common understanding of ideologies is captured by the language of left-wing and right-wing. People have a tendency to arrange ideologies from far left to far right and everything in between. And this is derivative of what we in the academic community sometimes refer to as the traditional spectrum of ideologies. The traditional spectrum of ideologies is a tool that we use to visually depict the differences between ideologies by arranging them on a spectrum from far left to far right, based on what each of the ideologies believe about the appropriate level of government control over people's economic, financial, and monetary interactions, agreements, or behaviors. On the very far left, we have ideologies that support a great deal of government control over the economy and people's financial behaviors, decisions, or interactions. On the right wing, we have a very small degree of government control and a much higher degree of individual autonomy or personal freedom when it comes to things like how you spend your money or run your business. Now, I do want to be clear about a couple of things. First, keep in the back of your mind as we move forward that this spectrum oversimplifies the process of formulating political ideologies to such an extent that it's not really accurate. So we're working here with an antiquated model. At the same time, I want you to understand that while it is true to say that on this spectrum, left-wing ideologies support more economic control and right-wing ideologies support more individual freedom, that doesn't mean that left-wing ideologies are bad and right-wing ideologies are good, or vice versa. It just means that they have a disagreement about one particular issue, how much government control we should cede when it comes to our financial behaviors, interactions, and decisions. It's also important to understand that there are reasons why different people disagree about the degree to which the government ought to control our economic and financial behaviors, decisions, or interactions. And the biggest distinction here has to do with priorities. Left-wing ideologies have a tendency to prioritize equality among groups, whereas right-wing ideologies have a tendency to prioritize individual freedom or liberty. And the reason that this is important is that what we're going to find is that the traditional spectrum really captures a tension, or at least a perceived tension, between group equality and individual freedom when it comes to people's economic interactions. The left-wing ideologies argue that while freedom is probably a good thing overall, all else being equal, it can lead to some very negative consequences if it's not restrained to at least some degree. In particular, they are concerned that if people are given the freedom necessary to do so, they will begin to engage in economic practices which create inequalities or disadvantage certain groups in terms of their financial outcomes in life. So the left-wing ideologies tend to say that in order to preserve equality, we must take away freedoms that might be abused by some people in the future to create inequality. The right-wing ideologies, on the other hand, have a tendency to say that they would be more willing to accept a certain degree of inequality in exchange for freedom. And there are also some reasons that will help to explain why left-wing ideologies tend to prioritize equality over freedom, whereas right-wing ideologies tend to prioritize freedom over equality. And this has to do with a second distinction that can also be used to array ideologies along a left-to-right dimension or spectrum. Generally speaking, what we're going to find is that left-wing ideologies tend to be more collectivist, meaning that they are group-oriented. They focus on the good of groups of people, whereas right-wing ideologies tend to be more individualistic. They focus on the interests, the wants, the needs, the rights, and freedoms of particular persons that exist within groups, but are not themselves all that concerned with the groups as a whole. And because these left-wing ideologies tend to be more concerned with the greater group and the right-wing ideologies tend to be more concerned with a particular person, they're going to have disagreements about what it actually means to be equal and how we go about obtaining equality. For left-wing ideologies, to acquire true equality means to usher in an era where we have what they refer to as equity or equality of outcome. Right-wing ideologies, on the other hand, believe that we should not strive for an equality of outcome, but rather that we should strive for an equality of opportunity. An equality of opportunity basically means that we have a level playing field. Nobody is allowed to cheat. So if you imagine this as a race among Olympic sprinters, an equality of opportunity means that everyone is equal at the starting line. That once that gun goes off, nobody's going to throw any elbows and nobody starts with a head start. Everyone is equal at the starting line. Now let me be clear. Right-wing ideologies acknowledge that we have not acquired a perfect equality of opportunity in our society. They're not making the claim that equality of opportunity is already perfectly manifest in Western civilization. Rather, they're making the claim that the equality of opportunity is what we should reach for. And this is distinct from the goal that the left-wing ideologies want us to reach for, because left-wing ideologies say that the equality of opportunity is not a good system or goal to reach for. In their minds, what we really need to reach for is an equality of outcome. If an equality of opportunity means that everyone is equal at the starting line, an equality of opportunity means that they are all equal at the finish line. And that sounds kind of peculiar. Because if you think about Olympic sprinters, it makes sense that the ones who are the naturally most talented and who work the hardest ought to be rewarded for their merits and for their hard work. And right-wing ideologies would agree with that. They argue that our economy ought to be treated like a meritocracy, where people who are very good at what they do are successful because their services become valuable, because they can do them well, and as a result, they get further in the race of life. People who are not as competent or who don't work as hard ought to fall behind. And when we're looking at individuals, that sounds perfectly fine. It sounds fair to say that the surgeon who works really hard and does a very good job ought to make more money and go further in his career than the one that's quite lazy and accidentally kills every other patient. But the left-wing ideologies aren't really all that interested in the individuals. Remember, they're concerned about the groups. So let's go back to our metaphor, looking at Olympic sprinters. Let's imagine that this particular race is not segregated by gender. So we have male and female athletes who are running side by side. If we give them an equality of opportunity, what that means is that the male athletes, having larger hearts, larger lungs, and stronger muscles, as well as more explosive metabolisms, are systematically more likely to finish in the top 3 slots than those female athletes. In this case, we're going to have an inequality of outcome, where men tend to do better than women overall. Now again, the right-wing ideologies aren't all that concerned with groups, so they would say this is fine. If a man is faster than a woman, well, then he ought to be rewarded for his natural talents, and he ought to be free to leverage those talents to capitalize on his quickness to get as far ahead in life as he would like, and we ought to reward him for doing so. But the left-wing ideologies aren't willing to accept that. They're not willing to accept that sometimes men are going to get ahead of women. And so they are going to argue that we need to take additional steps to ensure that if half of the top 10 slots go to men, half of them go to women. And in order to do this, we need a lot more government control than would be the case if we were only reaching for an equality of opportunity. To illustrate this, let's step momentarily away from our illustration of sprinters, and let's talk about the economy and education. So one thing that we know in society is that certain degrees tend to generate higher lifelong earning expectations than others. In particular, if you were to, say, get a degree in engineering, you could expect to do very, very well in the economy, because engineering is a very useful and it's a very economically valuable field to go into. On the other hand, if you were to get a degree in gender studies, then you could expect to be at best comfortably middle class teaching a gender studies course at a university somewhere in our country. Now, I'm not saying that gender studies is not a valuable field. It definitely is. It's just not economically very profitable. And this becomes an issue if you want to achieve an equality of outcome among men and women, because what we're going to discover is that men and women systematically have different interests. Why they have different interests is a subject to debate. Some people say it's biological, some people say it's social training. I don't know, and I don't expect you to figure it out in this course. What matters for our purposes here is that by and large, women are more likely to choose to major in gender studies because gender studies is, generally speaking, more interested to women than it is to men. Men, on the other hand, tend to exhibit a much greater interest in engineering, and therefore they are more likely than women to get an engineering degree. So if the men are choosing to get degrees in engineering and the women are choosing to get degrees in gender studies, then what we're going to find is that over time, men are going to be more wealthy than are women because men have chosen more profitable fields to professionalize in. And again, the right-wing ideologies say that's fine. As long as the women were allowed to choose a degree in engineering and simply opted not to do so, they haven't been harmed, and nobody can really be upset that they're not making as much as their male counterparts. But the left-wing ideologies say that's not true. And so in the left-wing ideology approach of equity, or grabbing for equality of outcome, it's not enough to just let people choose which field they want to major in or what job they want to take. You need to make sure that if half of the people majoring in engineering are men, the other half is women. And you need to make sure that you don't have more women going into gender studies than men. So some women who want to major in gender studies, they're going to have to go over and major in engineering. Some men who want to major in engineering are going to have to go over and get that degree in gender studies. Because if they don't, then over time, in aggregate, women are going to be disadvantaged financially as compared to men. And again, we're only talking about groups, but those left-wing ideologies are primarily concerned with the groups. And they're not all that concerned with establishing a meritocracy like the right-wing ideologies. Remember, a meritocracy says that the more talented an individual is, the better they serve in whatever job they are doing, the further in their career they should go. We should reward people and offer jobs and positions in college programs based on their merits, based on whether that particular individual is the best person for the job, whether he or she is competent. Things like their gender should not enter into the equation. Left-wing ideologies disagree. They think that whether you get hired or admitted to a program ought to depend, at least in part, on things like your race and your gender. Because we want to, again, make sure that we have diversity and that we have proportional representation. So if 13% of the general population is black, then about 13% of the college population ought to be black. And what that means is that if you have a single slot available and a white student applies and a black student applies, the white student might deserve, based purely on merits, a position, but because the college needs more African Americans to ensure diversity, it ought to prioritize the African American. So that's our first big distinction. Because these left-wing ideologies tend to be more collectivist and they tend to think about equality of outcome rather than just equality of opportunity, And because they tend to emphasize equality over liberty, they tend to want more government control over the economy, whereas right-wing ideologies, being more individualistic, more opportunity-oriented, and preferring meritocracy to the promotion of diversity, tend to favor a greater degree of individual freedom on the ground level. Now, I've taken this graphic directly out of your textbook, and it provides an illustration of what that left-wing ideology looks like and how it can be used to compare socialism, American liberalism, and American conservatism, as well as libertarianism. But you do need to understand that this is not a comprehensive list of all ideologies. There's just not enough time to talk about every ideology, and you can expand upon this list by adding communism to the left of socialism and anarchism to the right of libertarianism. Anarchism goes right of libertarianism because it wants less government control over people's financial behaviors than any of the other ideologies on this list. On the flip side, communism goes to the left of socialism because it wants more economic control. So let's talk just a little bit about the tenets of each of these ideologies: communism, socialism, American liberalism, American conservatism, libertarianism, and anarchism. Communism ultimately is a collectivist ideology, and therefore it places very little interest in the individual or the freedom of the individual to be his or her own master. And this is especially true when we're talking about economic issues. The communist society basically creates a complete prohibition on all private businesses or enterprise, as well as on any private property ownership. So in a communist society, you're not allowed to create a business. You're not allowed to own or operate a manufacturing plant, and you're not allowed to accumulate wealth. You can't save up your money. You're not allowed to have a house or a car or a lawn. You own nothing. All material goods, all valuable resources will be held by the government and will be run for the good of the community as a whole. So individuals don't get to choose their own jobs. They are appointed jobs, and they are going to earn an amount of money proportional to what they need, and nobody will ever be allowed to earn more money or accumulate more wealth than anybody else. Why do communist regimes have such a totalitarian approach to governing the economy? Well, because remember what we've already talked about. In these left-wing ideologies, there's a concern that if you give people too much economic freedom, they will choose to exercise that freedom in ways that create inequality among the groups. So, for example, if you allow somebody to create and become the CEO of a corporation, then as that corporation grows, this person's probably going to get quite very wealthy. And that's not necessarily going to be true of everybody that's employed by this individual. The CEO of the corporation is probably going to make a lot more money than the janitor. And what this means then is that the CEO will have a lot of income, the janitor will not have very much. We have an inequality of income, and that means that we don't have an equality of economic outcome. Communism is not willing to tolerate that kind of inequality. And so to prevent people from creating this situation where we have wealthy employers and poor employees, we just completely nationalize all agencies that produce or businesses that yield any service of economic value. Similarly, even if we assigned everyone to work conveyor belts, you might start to see some inequality if people are allowed to accumulate wealth or own property. Because one conveyor belt worker might save up his or her money, make very sound decisions in terms of how to invest and spend that money, and work extra hours. This individual would probably then, over time, save up a decent sum of money. They could do things like buy a house and then rent that house out to supplement their income with rent checks. Whereas the conveyor belt worker right next to this individual might be lazy and incompetent and might blow his or her money on booze and gambling. And if that's the case, then the gambler is going to fail, whereas the investor is going to succeed. There will be inequality. And again, if we're thinking about this from a right-wing individualist perspective, that seems fine, but the left-wing ideologies are not okay with the inequality here. And it's not because they want to reward the lazy person or punish the wealthy person. It's because they recognize that these individuals are going to have children. And so if we allow them to acquire property, then the person who has saved up their money and made good financial decisions, well, they're going to pass on a whole bunch of goods to their children, whereas the one that spent all their money on gambling and booze just leaves their children debt. And as a result of this, one child will automatically be rich, one child will automatically be poor, and it's through no fault of their own. They're basically being rewarded or punished based on the behavior of their parents. At least that's the perspective that the communists would articulate. So, communism tells us that there can be no private property or private enterprise. All businesses and all goods or services are owned, operated, and offered by the government. And this is their attempt to achieve a perfect equality of outcome in which all goods and services are distributed equitably across all different groups in society. You can contrast communism with socialism, which is still far left, but one step to the right of communism. It's not quite as extreme as communism. Socialism basically tells us that we do need a complete government takeover of all enterprise or business and industry. In other words, in a purely socialist society, you're not allowed to own your own company. You can't start a business. And again, that's because CEOs make more than the janitors they employ. And over time, companies will tend to take money, at least the socialists think so, and funnel it up to certain groups of people at the top. So to prevent that, the government's going to run all businesses. It's going to seize the means of production, and it's going to ensure that nobody is ever able to create their own business and exploit others for labor in order to enrich themselves. But they do believe that individuals ought to be allowed to own property. Now, they think there ought to be some fairly stringent limitations on the amount of property that you are allowed to accumulate and how you can or cannot pass that on, but you should be able to own property. Of course, they recognize that if we let people own property, some of them are going to gain more property than others because they make more sound financial decisions, and that will introduce just a very little bit of economic inequality, but they say that's okay. It is worth trading this little bit of economic inequality for just an extra ounce of individual freedom. And that's socialism. What's the difference between socialism and communism? In communism, you can't own property or business. In socialism, you can own property, but you can't own business. And that property is subject to very stringent government rules and regulations. All right, one step further to the right, we have American liberalism. And I've thrown a question mark after this term because I've included American liberalism on the list of collectivist left-wing ideologies. And while we can agree that it is moderately left-wing, it's not necessarily clear that American liberalism ought to be categorized as collectivist. It's certainly more individualist than socialism and communism, but it's more collectivist than the right-wing ideologies that we're going to talk about. So we're going to include it on this slide for the time being, and that's going to allow us to have 3 ideologies on the collectivist side, 3 ideologies on the individualist slide. Just understand that that's kind of arbitrary, and that some people would say that this ought to be considered a primarily individualist ideology that just has some collectivist tendencies. Doesn't matter. What you need to understand about American liberalism is that it is a left-wing ideology, meaning that it does tend to prioritize equality of outcome over individual liberty, but not to the same extent as either the socialists or the communists. American liberals don't want to nationalize property or business. They believe that industry is important, that entrepreneurship is valuable, and that people ought to be allowed to create businesses and engage in job-generating activities as a means of enriching themselves. So you are allowed to own a business in an American liberal society, and you are allowed to accumulate property. However, they want to see some substantial regulation of that property and that business. In other words, you're allowed to run a business, but not entirely. You get to run your business to an extent. You have to run your business in a way that complies with a certain set of rules and regulations published by the government, and these ought to be fairly stringent rules and regulations that are relatively hard to satisfy. So, for example, the American liberals have a tendency to say that we should not only have a minimum wage in our country, but that we ought to raise that minimum wage so that employers are required to pay everyone that works for them at least $15 or even $22 an hour. And while in Oklahoma, that sounds a bit strange to many of us, it's a position that's quite popular in other parts of the country. It's a position of American liberalism that we ought to raise the minimum wage to at least $15 an hour, perhaps more. And what we're going to discover then is that that does allow you to run a business, but only if you're running a business that pays everyone $15 an hour or more. You're not allowed to run a business that pays anybody $12 an hour or more. So you've got more freedom than you would in a socialist society where you wouldn't be allowed to have a business at all, but not quite as much as you would have in a society of American conservatism. American conservatism is generally considered individualistic, although it is a little bit close to collectivism. Just like we are going to have trouble placing liberalism, we sometimes have trouble placing American conservatism. These two are kind of in a gray area. American conservatism is going to be a grandson of American liberalism, and so is American liberalism. So don't confuse American liberalism with classic liberalism. That's actually more akin to what today we call libertarianism. And don't confuse American conservatism with classic conservatism, because those aren't the same either. American conservatives and American liberals actually have a lot more in common than they have separating them. The difference between them is a issue of degrees. The American conservatives do believe that there ought to be some government regulation, and they do believe that some of that government regulation ought to be geared towards ensuring a basic level of equality, even if that means sacrificing a certain degree of freedom. So, for example, American conservatives do believe there should be a minimum wage. They just don't want to make that minimum wage $15 an hour. They tend to be satisfied with the $7.25 per hour rate that we've got going right now. So American conservatives do want some regulation. They do want to sacrifice some freedom in order to promote a certain minimum amount of equality, but they don't want to sacrifice quite as much, and they don't want those regulations to be extremely burdensome, as do the liberals. They want them to be modest regulations. They want them to be reasonable regulations, and where we draw that line is going to depend on who you ask, but by and large, if you ask a conservative, they're not going to go as far as a liberal. And libertarians are a step even further to the right. Libertarians basically say that the government should have enough control to protect us from force and fraud. In other words, they ought not allow people to enslave each other, and they ought not allow people to go back on their contractual agreements. But there ought not be any victimless crimes, meaning that anybody is allowed to do whatever they want as long as they're not hurting anyone and everyone involved has consented to participate. As an example, libertarians tend to say that there shouldn't be any minimum wage whatsoever. They say that if I want to work for $2 an hour, I should be free as a grown man to make that decision and to set my own priorities. I ought not have to worry about how this will affect society as a whole or whether this is conducive to promoting equality for some group that I belong to. What should matter is, do I want to work for $2 an hour or not? If I don't, I ought not have to do so. I ought not be forced or tricked into doing so. But if I do want to take that job, well, the libertarian says I should be free to do so. And maybe they're right, maybe they're not, I don't know. But the bottom line is that this means we've got a great deal of individual freedom. And that's potentially going to leave a lot of room for inequality, but libertarians are willing to accept more inequality as long as it is inequality that results from the way in which people choose consensually to live their lives, and we have a great deal of personal freedom. Finally, we got anarchists. They're the furthest right on this spectrum because they say there ought be no government control. And the anarchists are going to tell us that there ought be no government control because they see all control as a form of coercion, and coercion is not a good thing in their eyes. So those are the ideologies that we need to talk about for the purposes of understanding the traditional spectrum. But I will remind you that the traditional spectrum is incomplete and not considered an accurate map of political ideologies anymore. And to illustrate that, let's jump back a couple of slides and let's look at our illustration and ask ourselves, where would fascism, the ideology of Mussolini and Hitler, fall on this spectrum? The answer to that question is at about the same place as socialism, because the fascists, the Nazis, and Mussolini, and so on and so forth, they tended to believe, quite like the socialists, that the government ought take over, that it ought to nationalize and run all industry or business, that you ought not have the freedom to own private businesses because that might lead to certain demographics or certain race groups getting an unfair share of society's wealth. In the socialist societies and among socialists in the United States today, the demographic that people are concerned with getting too rich are whites. In the fascist society of Nazi Germany, they were afraid of Jews getting too much money. But at the end of the day, they basically said, look, in order to keep one group from getting more money than others, we ought to have the government take over all business. And the socialists agree with that. But here's the thing. Socialists and fascists hated each other. They were killing each other, and they are not the same. If you think that fascism is a left-wing ideology, you're mistaken. Because what we're going to discover is that while we do see a great deal of disagreement between left-wing and right-wing ideologies about how much the government should control the economy, we also see a great deal of disagreement about how much control the government should exert over people's social or cultural behaviors, decisions, and interactions. And we're going to find that this, again, results from some competing values. There's competition and disagreement over how much the government should control our economy because there is competition and sometimes incompatibility between our desire to give individuals economic freedom and our desire to keep groups equal. So while we are going to see ideologies disagreeing over which to prioritize economic equality and economic liberty, we're also going to see that there is competition between ideologies over cultural liberty and cultural order. And that's what the four-cornered ideological grid does to improve upon the traditional spectrum. It adds a second dimension of variability by factoring in the fact that we also disagree about how much the government should control our social and cultural behavior. Now, what we're going to find when we use this four-cornered ideological grid is that ideologies can essentially be separated into one of four broad quadrants. And these quadrants are going to disagree primarily on two major questions. Number one, how much control should the government exert over people? And number two, where should that control be concentrated? Generally speaking, the three major ideologies do agree that there ought to be some degree of control. The only ideology that says no control whatsoever are going to be the anarchists, and let's be honest, they're not a major force in American politics. They're a legitimate perspective, and I'm not belittling them. There's nothing wrong with being an anarchist. What I'm telling you is that they don't have a great deal of force in American politics, and so for our purposes, we don't have time to discuss them. But there are three ideologies, at least, that do have a very big role to play, and these are going to be the liberals, the conservatives, and the libertarians. Remember, they disagree on where the government should exercise control and how much control. Liberals want to see more economic control, but less social control. Conservatives are the opposite. They want to see less economic and more social control. The reason that they want to see more social control is that they recognize that social control is a valuable tool for maintaining order, and that society can become very dangerous or chaotic and disorderly if we don't have any form of social control whatsoever. So, for example, if every different town in our country spoke a different language, that would make it really, really hard for our economy to function, and it would make it really, really hard for you to stay fed if you're on a road trip. So, what we're going to find is that the government did exert some degree of social control because it used to be that every town did speak its own language, and now essentially everyone speaks English. Why? Because we had state-run education designed to encourage people to speak English. That's the government exerting influence over individuals, taking away a little bit of freedom in order to promote a greater degree of order. The same thing is true of rules against looting in a natural disaster, or murder, or spousal abuse. All of these things put people in danger. And so we're going to take away your freedom to engage in these activities in order to protect people and in order to keep society safe. So libertarians are going to be the third of these ideologies, and they want less control both in the social and economic arenas. And I want to pause here and make sure that we do understand that, again, all of these ideologies agree that there ought to be some degree of control, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. Right? Control sounds like a dirty word in general. But when we get specific, we're going to find that pretty much all of us do support some form of both social and economic control. As an example, pretty much everybody agrees that you ought not be allowed to shout fire in a crowded movie theater because that might cause a panic, put other people in danger, and cause somebody to be harmed. Well, who's going to prevent me or punish me if I do choose to shout fire in a crowded movie theater? That's going to be the government. So if you say that I shouldn't be allowed to call in false bomb threats, shout fire in a movie theater, so on and so forth, you are advocating for some degree of social control, government control over my speech in this case. But most of us probably wouldn't be comfortable if the government decided to censor me not because I was putting people in danger, but because I was criticizing political leaders or sharing unpopular opinions. We want some degree of social control. We want some degree of speech control, enough to keep people safe, enough to keep society orderly, enough to prevent people from causing a panic, but not so much that we are no longer able to speak our mind. Similarly, pretty much everybody agrees that there ought to be some degree of economic control, even the libertarians. Libertarians, for example, say that if you enter into a contract with an employer, where that employer agrees to pay you $8 an hour, he or she ought be forced by the government to actually follow through and pay you $8 an hour. He or she ought not be allowed, ought not be free to go back to renege on that contract by paying you only $2 an hour, because that would be fraud. And remember, the libertarians do believe that the government has a role in protecting people from fraud. So what we're going to find is that we all support some degree of both social and economic control. But for our final learning objective, we also need to make sure that we can distinguish between social and economic issues. So here's the general rule of thumb. Economic issues are those that deal with how you earn or spend your money, what you buy or sell under what rules and regulations, and how you operate or run your business. If it doesn't relate to money in some way, shape, or form, if it isn't pertinent to business or employment contracts or something of that nature, it's not an economic issue. FDA requirements that all GMO foods being sold at grocery stores are economic regulations, making rules about what you can and cannot sell. You can sell GMOs that are labeled. You cannot sell GMOs that are not labeled. It's making rules about how to run your business. If you produce GMO foods, you need to label them. So those are what economic issues look like, but you also need to be familiar with social issues. Social issues are basically everything else. They're sometimes called cultural issues, but really what we're talking about are human interactions, behaviors, and relationships that don't revolve around money or business. So if it doesn't relate to what you buy or sell, how you earn or spend your money, or how you run your business, it's probably a social issue. Now, you might have heard some people tell you that social issues are basically personal issues. They're personal lifestyle choices that some people want to restrict. And while that may be true in at least certain cases, it's not always the case. Sometimes your social behaviors have sweeping ramifications for society as a whole. So, for example, if you decide to shoot up black tar heroin, that is a social rather than an economic issue. It's not pertinent to how you're spending or earning your money. It's not pertinent to how you're running your business. It's just a decision that you're making. But if enough people start deciding that they want to shoot up black tar heroin, that's going to have some pretty sweeping consequences for society as a whole. Similarly, if you decide to beat your wife, that decision is a social decision. It's a decision relating to how you socialize with your spouse. And some of us are going to say, most of us are going to say, that you ought not be allowed to do that. So these are not personal choices. They're just choices that relate to things and interactions outside of the economic sector. And really, that's all we need to talk about for this week's lecture. So I hope this was useful to you, and I hope you have good luck with our assessment this week and with our discussion boards. Y'all stay classy, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.